Imagine a politician looking right into a camera on national television and openly admitting that they are willing to create stories just to get the media's attention.
Yeah, just saying it out loud.
Right. And then imagine that same politician's deeply religious base, not only ignoring that statement, but like actually supporting them even more passionately because of it.
It's wild to think about.
It really is.
Yeah.
How does that happen? How does a faith tradition that places truth at the very center of its moral universe suddenly embrace manufacturing a narrative as a legitimate political tactic? Welcome to the deep dive.
It's a profound contradiction. And honestly, it is exactly the kind of complex dynamic we are going to explore today. We're looking at this fascinating, highly detailed ethical analysis of the political alliance between JD Vance and Donald Trump.
Yeah.
And specifically how they utilize religion to build that alliance.
Okay, but before we go a single step further, I need to speak directly to you, the listener, and make something unequivocally clear. The materials you've provided for us today contain some, well, highly politically charged content.
Very much so.
Yeah. This analysis touches on intense left-wing and right-wing topics, and we are talking about two very prominent political figures. So I want to state for the record right now, we are not taking any sides here.
Absolutely not.
We are not endorsing any viewpoints. We are not campaigning for any candidates. And we are certainly not here to judge the state of anyone's soul. Our only goal today is to impartially report and analyze the ideas, the data, and the frameworks contained in the original research that you shared with us.
And I think that framing is essential. I really do. Because the core thesis of the research isn't that it's inherently dangerous for politicians to be religious. I mean, religion has been deeply intertwined with American politics since the country's founding.
Right. George Washington was talking about it.
Exactly. The real tension, the friction the author wants us to examine today arises when core Christian concepts, things like mercy, universal human dignity, objective truth, when those things end up colliding with a very specific operational brand of nationalist moral politics.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because before we get into Vance and Trump specifically, we really need to understand the playing field. The text keeps mentioning this phrase, Christian nationalism. What does the data actually tell us about, who these voters are and what they believe?
Well, the numbers paint a very specific and frankly a massive picture. So according to Pew Research, 82% of white evangelical registered voters support Donald Trump.
82%. That is a huge majority.
It is a bedrock base of support. But the analysis goes deeper into the why. It introduces data from PRRI, which is the Public Religion Research Institute, and they measure this specific phenomenon of Christian nationalism.
Got it.
And just so we are defining our terms clearly for this discussion, the data defines Christian nationalism as the belief that American identity, the U.S. government, and Christianity are fundamentally, inextricably linked together.
Wait, hold on. Let me stop you there. Because looking at the data, it says 30% of Americans qualify as either adherents or sympathizers of this worldview. 30% of the country is what, roughly 100 million people?
Give or take, yeah.
Are all of these people actually going to church every Sunday and reading heavy theology, or has this identity morphed into something else entirely?
That is the critical distinction right there. The research suggests that for a lot of people in this demographic, it isn't necessarily about weekly church attendance or deeply held theological orthodoxy.
Okay.
It has become more of an ethnocultural identity. And when you isolate that PRI data to just Republicans, the number jumps to 53% who are adherents or sympathizers.
Wow, over half.
Over half. But here is the data point that really illuminates the mindset. Among the strong adherents of Christian nationalism, 67% believe that God specifically chose Donald Trump to win the election.
See, that completely reframes how you look at a ballot box.
Oh, entirely.
If you genuinely believe God ordained a specific candidate, you aren't just voting on tax policy anymore. I mean, it's cosmic at that point. So let me try an analogy here to make sure I'm wrapping my head around the ethical shift the author is talking about.
Sure, go for it.
So traditional Christian ethics acts kind of like a universal open door, right? It's focused on serving the vulnerable no matter who they are, where they come from, what nation they belong to.
Right.
But Christian nationalism acts a lot more like a VIP club bouncer. It uses religion as a marker to decide who belongs to the in-group and who gets kept out on the street. Does that track?
Yeah, that is a highly effective way to visualize the mechanics of it. The primary question shifts from the traditional religious question of, who is my neighbor, to the strictly political question of who belongs to our nation.
But I want to push back on this premise just a bit, because using religious language to shape U.S. politics isn't exactly a modern right-wing invention.
No, definitely not.
I mean, Martin Luther King Jr. famously used deep, resonant religious rhetoric to drive the civil rights movement. So how does this analysis actually draw the line between MLK's use of faith and this modern nationalist approach? Like, why is one celebrated and the other critiqued in the text?
It's a great question. The difference lies in the direction the rhetoric is pointing. The author points out that MLK used faith to demand universal rights.
Okay.
When he wrote from the Birmingham jail that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere, he was using the language of faith to tear down boundaries and demand inclusion.
Right, expanding the circle.
Exactly. He was basically saying, we are all part of this divine creation, therefore we all deserve rights. Nationalist rhetoric operates in the exact opposite direction. It uses religious language to build walls and draw boundaries against outsiders. It becomes a cultural signal of belonging to an exclusive group rather than an ethical obligation to all of humanity.
Okay, so that establishes the broad landscape. Now let's look at the specific actors, starting with JD Vance. The text argues that Vance is the one providing the intellectual and moral philosophical framework for this modern movement. How does a single senator build that kind of foundation?
Well, Vance operates on a very different wavelength than typical populist politicians. He explicitly utilizes his Catholic faith and classical philosophical concepts of the common good to frame his politics.
Interesting.
Yeah, he doesn't just talk about family as a nice social unit. He constructs it as a hard political boundary.
Which brings us to the quote that practically broke the internet in 2021. Vance referred to Democratic leaders as childless cat ladies who are miserable in their own lives and therefore want to make the rest of the country miserable too.
Right.
Now, to be completely fair to the materials provided, they do note that Vance later defended the remark as sarcastic.
He did, yeah.
But they also point out that he stood firmly by the core argument beneath the sarcasm.
And that core argument is what we really need to examine here. He argued that people without children have no direct stake in the country's future, and that the Democratic Party has fundamentally become anti-family.
Wow.
And he didn't just limit this to abstract groups either. He extended this logic to direct attacks on educators, specifically targeting the union leader, Randi Weingarten.
Oh, right. I remember reading that part.
Yeah, he stated that she doesn't have a single child of her own and therefore should leave ours alone.
But wait, let's play devil's advocate for a second. If family is universally seen as a foundational good, which it is in almost every culture on Earth, isn't it entirely fair for a politician to say that having kids gives you a literal physical stake in the next 50 years of the country?
It's a common argument, sure.
Why is the analysis calling that a weapon? Where exactly does he cross the line from just being pro-family to something ethically problematic?
It becomes problematic when political participation and human value become implicitly weighted by biological parenthood. The ethical tension highlighted here is that by claiming only parents have a direct stake in the future, childlessness is turned into a mark of political suspicion.
I see.
It essentially suggests that if you don't have biological children, your voice matters less, your investment in society is questionable, and, your motives are suspect.
It effectively devalues the civic participation of millions of people who just live differently.
It does. And the text points out a profound irony in this approach, too. Deep Christian tradition, the very tradition Vance often cites, heavily honors non-biological caregiving.
Oh, like nuns and priests.
Exactly. Nuns, priests, lifelong educators, social workers, mentors. The traditional Christian view of human dignity isn't derived strictly from biological reproduction. It's derived simply from being human.
Right.
So when a politician uses the concept of family to delegitimize the political voice of an opponent, they're stepping away from that universal dignity and using biology as an exclusionary tool.
So Vance is laying down this dense philosophical framework about the common good and who actually has a stake in the country. But philosophy doesn't fill stadiums.
No, it doesn't.
A theoretical argument about the common good doesn't get tens of thousands of people wearing the same hat and cheering at rallies. So how does this actually translate into millions of votes on the ground?
That is exactly where Donald Trump enters the equation. Where Vance uses moral philosophy and intellectual boundaries, Trump operationalizes those ideas through what the research calls charismatic, effective mobilization.
Wait, effective mobilization, is that just an academic way of saying he plays to their emotions, or is there specific psychology at work here?
It's much deeper than just making people feel happy or sad. Effective mobilization means bypassing the logical, policy-driven part of the brain and tapping directly into deep-seated identity and survival instincts.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it is about creating a visceral bond of loyalty. Trump frames himself as the ultimate, indispensable protector of the faithful against a hostile world.
Which brings up his rhetoric at the Turning Point Believers Summit in 2024. The text notes he told the crowd, Christians have to vote, and you have tremendous power. He isn't just speaking to them as citizens. He is explicitly mobilizing them as a religious bloc.
And that very same speech included the quote that generated massive headlines. He said, "You won't have to vote anymore, my beautiful Christians."
Yeah, that caused a huge uproar.
It did. Now, the materials make a very fair concession here, which we should definitely acknowledge. It notes that this can absolutely be read as campaign hyperbole.
Like a clumsy way of saying, just get me over the finish line this one time?
Exactly. Rather than a literal autocratic plan to end all future American elections.
But even with that generous interpretation, the analysis still flags it as democratically risky. Why?
Because of the underlying framing. It frames the election not as a normal democratic process of ongoing debate, but as a final messianic fix. The subtext is, vote now, put me in power, and all the cultural and spiritual battles will be permanently solved.
It's apocalyptic language.
It is. You see that same rhetoric echoed in his second inaugural address, where he outright stated, "I was saved by God to make America great again."
Here's where it gets really interesting, because you can see how perfectly these two leaders complement each other's weaknesses. Trump provides the mass loyalty, the emotional energy, and the mythos of the chosen, divinely protected leader.
Right.
Meanwhile, Vance provides the cultural legitimacy, the policy frameworks, and the intellectual justification for the movement. They are two halves of the exact same strategy.
They are. And this raises a fascinating theological problem that the author digs into. Deep Christian tradition has historically emphasized humility, the constant awareness of one's own flaws, and strict absolute limits on earthly power.
Why?
Because earthly power is inherently corruptible.
Right. Power corrupts. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. It's why the founders built checks and balances.
Precisely. But when a leader frames their literal physical survival and their political victory as a direct mandate from God to rule, religion suddenly stops being a moral check on their behavior. Instead, it transforms into a shield against any and all criticism.
That is a dangerous flip.
Think of it like a divine immunity idol in a game. If you convince your base that God specifically chose you to lead, then anyone criticizing your policies isn't just a political opponent. They are actively interfering with God's plan.
Man, so we have Vance drawing the intellectual boundaries of who belongs, and Trump claiming the divine mandate to lead them. Let's look at what happens when these abstract strategies hit the real world. What happens to the people on the ground? The materials point to two major collisions with marginalized groups, right? Oh. LGBTQ rights and immigration.
Yeah, let's examine the LGBTQ and gender debates first. The text tracks Vance's consistent use of terms like groomers and his railing against what he calls crazy gender theory.
Right.
He also heavily supported the Protect Children's Innocence Act, which was designed to federally criminalize gender-affirming care for minors.
And Trump matched this intensity at the executive level, too. The text cites an executive order aimed at recognizing only two sexes, male and female, and explicitly defining gender ideology as an institutional failure that the government must actively counter.
Now, the critique here isn't that conservative politicians aren't allowed to debate gender theory or medical standards. In a functioning democracy, those are absolutely legitimate debates to have.
Sure.
The ethical line is crossed when the rhetoric fundamentally shifts from a policy disagreement to a moral panic.
How so?
Well, when a politician associates an entire demographic of people and the educators or doctors who support them with child abuse by using terms like groomers, they're changing the rules of engagement. They're framing the opponent not as a citizen with a different view, but as an existential predatory threat to children.
It's that bouncer at the club again, but escalated. You aren't just wrong about tax policy, you're a danger to society and must be expelled.
Exactly.
Which is the exact same dynamic we see with immigration in the text.
Very much so. Trump issued an executive order explicitly citing an invasion at the southern border. And if we look back at that PRRI data on Christian nationalism from earlier, it shows massive, widespread agreement among adherents that migrants are literally poisoning the blood of the country.
Which leads us directly to the situation in Springfield, Ohio. The materials detail Vance's claims about Haitian immigrants causing absolute chaos in the town, supposedly eating neighborhood pets and causing local rates of HIV and tuberculosis to skyrocket.
Right, those were the claims.
But the research also includes the vital fact checks that immediately followed those claims, which is important to highlight.
Yes, the factual reality on the ground was starkly different from the rhetoric. The Republican governor of Ohio, Mike DeWine, alongside multiple independent organizations, thoroughly debunked these claims.
Right, the governor himself stepped in.
He did. The Haitian immigrants were largely there legally. Many were operating under temporary protected status, and they came specifically to fill labor shortages. And local health department data showed absolutely no evidence to support the claims of skyrocketing infectious diseases.
And when Vance was pressed on this discrepancy in a CNN interview, he said, "If I have to create stories so that the American media actually pays attention, then that's what I'm going to do."
That's the quote.
Now, again, context is important here. Vance later defended this by saying he meant creating media attention to highlight a real issue of local strain on resources, not inventing facts out of thin air.
But the author argues that even with that subsequent defense, the ethical implications of that moment are profound. It reveals a highly functional, almost cynical view of truth.
How do you mean?
The truth becomes less about objective, verifiable reality and more about whatever narrative is required to win the daily news cycle and advance the political agenda.
See, I'm struggling with this part. How does someone reconcile deeply held religious faith with openly admitting to creating stories for media attention? I mean, isn't telling the truth a core, non-negotiable tenet of the Christian faith? You are literally warned about bearing false witness.
It is a massive contradiction, and it's why the text introduces a concept from the German theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Bonhoeffer was a pastor who actively resisted the Nazi Party's attempt to co-opt the German church in the 1930s. He coined the term cheap grace.
Cheap grace. What exactly does that mean in this context?
Cheap grace is the idea of demanding the comforts and rewards of religion without accepting any of the difficult disciplines or ethical obligations that come with it. It's grace without discipleship.
Oh, I get it. Like getting the reward without doing the work.
Exactly. And the argument here is that treating the truth as just a strategic tool for media attention is the ultimate modern form of cheap grace. You are getting the political reward, the attention, the rallying of the base, while completely ignoring the real-world harm it causes to your actual neighbors.
Real-world harm, like the dozens of bomb threats that actually shut down schools and government buildings in Springfield as a direct result of those stories.
Exactly. Bonhoeffer warned against using religion to excuse harm or absolve yourself of responsibility to the vulnerable. The political rhetoric of invasion and disease stands in stark contrast to traditional Christian ethics regarding the stranger.
Right.
To highlight this, the text points to Pope Francis, who outlined 4 specific verbs for how a society should treat migrants: welcoming, protecting, promoting, and integrating.
That's a very different approach.
It's totally different. Pope Francis repeatedly calls for an ever wider we, actively pushing back against the narrow us versus them mentality of nationalism. The traditional Christian social framework fundamentally starts with the life and dignity of the human person, prioritizing people over political utility.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener? We've covered a massive amount of ground today, from polling data on Christian nationalism to philosophical debates about the common good, all the way to the real-world impacts in Ohio.
We really have.
But the overarching theme of this deep dive and the source material you provided was never about judging anyone's soul. It was about understanding systems. It's about recognizing the deep temptation to use faith not as a call to serve the vulnerable, but as a shiny, powerful tool to dominate political opponents.
And if we connect everything we've discussed today to the bigger picture, it leaves us with a critical, almost existential question moving forward.
Lay it on us.
If a political movement succeeds in completely merging a nation's identity with a specific religious identity, what happens to the core message of that religion once it inevitably has to compromise in the messy, corruptible reality of daily governance?
Oh, that's heavy.
Does the state actually become more religious, or does the religion just get hollowed out until it becomes nothing more than another bureaucratic branch of the government?
That is a phenomenal question to chew on. Think back to that idea of the VIP bouncer versus the open door. Are we using these frameworks to build a bigger shelter for everyone, or are we just figuring out new ways to keep people out? Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive, and as always, keep questioning the information around you.